and welcome back. I'm Elizabeth and this is Time Scholar and I'm very happy to have you here yet again today. I apologise for my sort of week-long hiatus there, but my degree is done and my dissertation is in, so I am back with a video every week for you guys. And today's video is actually a request. It's my first request as well, and today I'm going to be discussing the 1651 Battle of Worcester. This actually really interested me. I had to do a lot of research into it because it's not really my area of expertise. I tend to lean far more sort of to the modern history side or to the ancient history side. This is really in an area that I had to do a lot of research for, but it really interested me actually. So the battle itself, what really was sort of the pivotal moment in a series of English civil wars. And it really had its roots in various different places. You know, the Civil Wars itself had roots in Scotland from 1639, before spreading to Ireland and then England in 1642, with the Battle of Worcester really being sort of the pivotal and final moment of these English civil wars. So if that sounds like something that interests you, be sure to grab a cup of tea, coffee, or whatever beverage you prefer, sit back and let's go. So there is a lot of context really to discuss before you even get to sort of the Battle of Worcester in 1651. So I'm just going to really discuss a bit of that context because it is really important in kind of understanding the battle in and of itself. So the roots of the conflict really stretched back decades to a less than great relationship between Charles I and Parliament. Charles I was a believer in the divine right of the king. He didn't really think that Parliament should be controlling what he was doing. He believed that, like, he was the king, he was the monarchy, so he should be able to do what he wanted without MPs really getting involved. And this really led to him resisting any form of sort of parliamentary control or sort of action in regards to how he was ruling at the time. So from 1629, he actually governed without Parliament. He dismissed all of Parliament and was like, go away. I'm the king, I'm gonna rule. So from 1629, he ruled without Parliament for 11 years, so just over a decade. And he really did this through raising money through far less than sort of ideal means. You know, he did it through forced loans, fines on traditional feudal rights, other less than great, more sketchy ways to raise money as well. And many people in England under his control were not really a fan of this at the time because they saw it as, at the least, rather tyrannical and at the most downright illegal, the way that he was trying to control things. So at the same time that this was happening as well, Charles I's sort of religious policies were leaning towards a very highly ceremonial Anglicism kind of outlook and way of being, which in itself was feared by the Puritans at the time because they really feared a return to Catholic practice as well. So there was a lot more going on rather than just Charles being like, I'm all right, thanks, I'll rule by myself. There was a lot going on around it, and there was clearly a lot that kind of built up into a powder keg as to why these civil wars really occurred. So it's safe to say that this was not an ideal time in England at this point either. So it was actually in 1637 that Charles made a rather fateful decision for himself, which was trying to impose the English prayer book on Scotland, which, as you can imagine, did not go down a treat. So this actually led to a Scottish rebellion, which sparked the Bishops' War of 1637 to 1640. And this ultimately led Charles to recalling Parliament after a decade of telling them to, you know, for lack of a better term, just go away. He was fine, he didn't need them. Because he needed money to fund his campaigns in battle. That's the only reason he called them back. He was running out of money and he couldn't continue fighting in the Bishops' Wars without the money. You know, complete thing that he bought on himself, but that's by the by. But instead of granting these funds that he wanted, Parliament didn't do that. They didn't come back and sort of just go, no worries, Charles, here's the money, we'll just go back, don't you do your thing. No, Parliament actually challenged his authority to quite a large extent and actually impeached his ministers, and worked to dismantle elements of royal power as well. So by calling Parliament back, Charles really dug his own grave, for lack of a better term, and by 1642, all of this distrust had led to a complete collapse. And that's when Charles raised his standard at Nottingham, and the kingdom was plunged into what is known as the First English Civil War. So overall, it really started with Charles I and his dislike for Parliament, and all of that kind of snowballed into what became the First English Civil Wars, the Second English Civil Wars, and which culminated in the end in the Battle of Worcester in 1651. So what were even the wars before Worcester? So there was a lot going on, as I have kind of alluded to, before Worcester even happened. And there was so much going on before Worcester. And firstly, it was the First English Civil War, which lasted from 1641 to 1646, which pitted the Royalists, known as the Cavaliers, against the Parliamentarians, also known as the Roundheads. And earlier battles like Edge Hill in 1642 were indecisive, but like over time, the Parliamentarians really started to sort of gain traction and gain an advantage. And at Marston Moor in 1644, with crucial Scottish support at this point as well, the Parliament was able to secure the north of England. And then in 1645, Parliament reorganised their forces into a newly named sort of group called the New Model Army, which was known to be a disciplined, professional, and sort of ideological motivated fighting group. So at this point, it seems that Parliament is just, they've done it, Parliament won. But this same year, they actually also managed to smash Charles's, so this is still Charles I, his main army at Naseby, capturing his baggage train and also finding out that he was seeking Catholic and foreign aid, which went down incredibly badly. I can tell you that for free. So by 1646, Charles actually surrendered to the Scots and therefore to the Parliamentarians, because the Scots turned him over to the English Parliament, and the Royalist cause appeared completely broken. It seemed as if, that was that. Parliament had won, Charles was done for lack of a better term. But this series of wars was not the end, because this was actually followed by the Second English Civil War, which spanned from 1647 to, depending on which sources you read, either 1649 or 1651, depending on whether you class the last 2 years of these battles in with that as well. And Charles I was now in captivity, but that actually did not stop him at all. He was still plotting a return to power, captivity or not. So in 1647, he actually escaped from imprisonment. He was actually imprisoned at this time at Hampton Court, which, fun fact, was somewhere that Henry VIII used as a hunting lodge. And he escaped for a while, but he was actually later re-imprisoned at Carisbrooke Castle. And from here, he actually took part in different negotiations with both English parliamentarians and Scottish parliaments. In regard to the Scottish Parliament, which I personally think is the more overarching agreement that he came to, he promised concessions in exchange for military support. And those concessions, was a secret deal. It was known as the engagement. And this was where military support would be provided in turn for establishing Presbyterianism in England, which was a very large sort of sect of religion in Scotland at the time. So this ultimately led to the Second English Civil War, because one civil war was not enough. And here a series of royalist uprisings in England and also a fresh Scottish invasion as well. So it really hit the ground running, for lack of a better term. However, this was relatively short-lived, with the New Model Army now led by Oliver Cromwell, which is a name I feel like a lot of English people educated in the UK know quite well, and Sir Thomas Fairfax, crushing these threats, most notably at the Battle of Preston as well. So this second round of conflict led to a really decisive attitude for many. Many in the army concluded that Charles I could never be trusted and that peace was completely impossible while he still lived, because not only was he having discussions with English parliaments, he was having discussions with Scottish parliaments, he was trying to bring in Presbyterianism, he was trying to get military aid, he also, if we think back to the baggage train, when he was looking for foreign aid and Catholic intervention, there was a lot of people standing up going, we cannot trust this guy, let alone as our king. And this actually had a lot of knock-on effects, such as Colonel Thomas Pride's Pride Purge in December of 1648. And this is where he forcibly removed MPs who were in favour with negotiating with the king. And this remaining parliament then actually put Charles I on trial for treason against his people. So it was already set up there, because there were no parliamentarians left who were going to agree with him, because Thomas Pride made sure of that. And on the 30th of January in 1649, Charles I was actually executed outside of the banqueting house in Whitehall in London. And this led to the monarchy and the House of Lords as well being abolished, so we were just left with the House of Commons, and England being declared a Commonwealth, which was now under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. So what was really the road to Worcester between, 1649 and 1651, with Cromwell becoming, well, he wasn't king, but he called himself Lord Protector, actually, is what he ended up calling himself later on, but now that England was under control of Oliver Cromwell. So the execution of Charles I actually really shocked Europe and transformed the political map of the British Isles as well. Ireland really erupted in a royalist resistance, but this was really brutally suppressed by Cromwell and is a campaign that is really remembered for its massacres at Drogheda and also Wexford as well. And Scotland also rejected the authority of the English Commonwealth at this point, and they actually proclaimed Charles II as the King of the Scots on the 5th of February in 1649, but it wasn't until 1651 that he was actually coronated at Scone Castle in Perthshire. And that was actually the last coronation to happen at Scone Castle in Perthshire as well, which I found quite interesting. But Cromwell, however, saw this, his sort of Charles's claim as, not claim, but the way he was envisioned as, you know, the King of the Scots and then eventually also coronated as that, as a big threat, massive threat to him, because that meant that Scotland could become a base of royalist restoration and royalist uprising again. You know, suddenly there was somebody against him there was this big, you know, area of people who could come and try and stop his Commonwealth and bring back the monarchy. So in 1650, Cromwell actually marched north in order to deal with what he saw as a Scottish challenge to his rule. And at the Battle of Dunbar in September of that year, he actually won. So it seemed like he had sort of suppressed the royalist cause once again. But the Scots weren't destroyed by this battle by any means. After the coronation of Charles II, as I previously discussed, he and his advisors actually devised a plan to march into England, rally royalist sympathisers that still were in England, and overthrow the Commonwealth government. So Cromwell was not getting off scot-free by any means at this point, because Charles II, he had a plan, and it was one that involved a lot of fighting. So in July of 1651, Charles actually led an army of about 16,000, mainly Scots, with some English royalists as well, into England, but it was mainly a Scottish army. And he hoped that him being there, you know, his presence would inspire a lot of support towards the royalist side. He was hoping that he'd walk through England and he'd be able to sort of gain a lot of supporters, and he'd be like, look, I'm the King of the Scots, I'm the heir to the throne, follow me, we can bring back the monarchy, we can get rid of Oliver Cromwell, we can get rid of the Commonwealth. But it didn't really happen. That wasn't really the case as much as that's what he wanted, because the English population really stayed largely neutral or just avoided him completely. I don't know whether it was, you know, due to the fear of war or the fear of Cromwell, but they just really kind of just left him to his own devices, which meant he didn't really gain too many other supporters on his travels through England. You know, because to many, Charles was now seen as the head of a foreign army. He was head of Scotland, you know, and rather than a liberator of the Commonwealth. So by becoming King of the Scots, he had really sort of almost shot himself in the foot, for lack of a better term, in regards to trying to gain English support. And Cromwell was still pursuing him at this point as well. He had actually commanded nearly 28,000 parliamentarian troops. So that is, 12,000 more people than Charles II had, which is just an astronomically different number, especially in battle. You know, they were definitely outnumbered, almost 2-1 really. So by late August, Cromwell had reached Worcester, and although the city was small, it actually had natural defences, which is why he kind of decided to sit there and wait. And it lay between the rivers of the Severn and the Teme, and its medieval walls could be strengthened, so it actually gave a lot of sort of natural defence to the battle, and something that, you know, the parliamentarians could really strive for. And it was here that Charles would actually make his stand, and the fate of the monarchy would later be decided. So it was late August that they both arrived in Worcester, and it would be early September that the Battle of Worcester would begin. So the battle itself, the Battle of Worcester, so it took place on the 3rd of September of 1651, and it was actually this morning that Cromwell began his attack. So he divided his forces into 3 groups, really going for a sort of methodological and sort of systematic approach to his sort of fighting, which was very on par for Cromwell. So he moved one group to cut off the northern approaches, to secure bridges, another, which was under the control of Fleetwood and Lambert as well. It were tasked with forcing a crossing of the River Teme, and Cromwell himself was actually in charge of the main assault into Worcester from the east. So he had split up his army of 28,000 people. He had kept some reserves as well, but I feel like it's very important to just keep in mind 28,000 people. And they were going every which way. He was solid, he had a plan, and he was going to enact it. And at the beginning, the Royalists actually resisted very well to everything that Cromwell had put in place. along the team, the parliamentarian forces really struggled to gain a foothold against the defenders, with the Scottish army really fighting hard, pushing back several attempts as well, and attacks, but overall, it was due to the sheer number of Cromwell's army, again 28,000 against 16,000, that he was able to press in more troops. He could call people back who hadn't been included in these three little groups, and he had the capability to kind of recycle, for lack of a better term, men, and eventually he overwhelmed the defenders and secured these crossings into Worcester as well. But Charles II didn't see this as a complete negative, he actually saw it as an opportunity. So he personally led an attack from the city, attempting to drive back Cromwell's troops east of Worcester. So it was a really head-on-head battle here, because Cromwell was in charge of the troops heading east from Worcester, and Charles II was like, not on my watch, mate, and they had a really head-to-head battle. And the Royalists really pushed forward with a surprising force as well, but Cromwell quickly deployed more of his army, because again, it was just so much bigger than Charles's, and he ultimately drove Charles back into the city. And the decisive moment really came when the parliamentarian troops captured Fort Royal. This was a stronghold on the high ground southeast of Worcester, and the parliamentarians, that's where the Royalists had really sort of gained a stronghold, and the parliamentarians actually turned Royalist guns against the city and poured fire into Worcester itself. And this in itself became a problem because, it not only just physically, but also psychologically, because for the Royalists that was their stronghold and it had been taken. So they were fighting sort of a big sort of psychological battle as well as just the battle in front of them at this point. And this blow was substantial, as I just said. It really led to sort of the Royalist resistance crumbling, and it ended up with the parliamentarians storming through the gate. And the entire battle devolved into street combat, It was no longer sort of what we imagine as battle. It was like fistfights on the street, houses being set alight, and defenders being overwhelmed. It was no longer just a battle anymore, but it was also really the destruction of a city. And Charles II actually fled from this. He didn't get captured. He fled with a few men and began his now famous and legendary escape. And by evening, Worcester was firmly in the hands of Oliver Cromwell, and that was it. He had won. So this was a devastating loss for the Royalists. Bearing in mind they had 16,000 men, about 3,000 were killed, and as many as 10,000 were taken prisoner. So if you just think about that, only 3,000 of them weren't killed or weren't taken prisoner, which is an insane number for you to lose that much of your army, either to, death in battle or prisoners of war. But the parliamentarians only lost 200 people out of 28,000. So it was a massive difference for them, absolutely huge. It was clear that they had the upper hand from the beginning, no matter what the Royalists tried to do. So the captured Royalists, most of whom were Scottish, again, because they marched down from Scotland with Charles II, who was deemed the King of the Scots, they were forced into indentured servitude overseas or labour in Britain, so they became prisoners of war for the rest of their lives, really. And this parliamentarian victory also effectively ended the English civil wars because there wasn't anything to fight for anymore, really. The Royalists had been completely disposed, Charles II had run off, he'd escaped, Cromwell had won, so the Commonwealth was just going to continue as it was. There was a lot to the aftermath and Charles's escape though, which is very important to discuss. So Worcester really paid a very large price for actually being royalists, giving their loyalty to Charles II rather than giving their loyalty to Cromwell and the Commonwealth. So the city was plundered, and particularly Worcester Castle was awfully vandalised, and it was almost sent into complete disrepair by parliamentarian forces, and the city itself was, completely and utterly vandalised and sent into disrepair. And the city itself also then, because of all of the things that they had to fix, suffered significant economic hardship as well. So there was a lot of knock-on effects. It wasn't just Cromwell got the Commonwealth, but Worcester itself dealt with a lot of sort of negative aftermath from the battle, which is more so than just a battle being fought in your streets, if that makes sense. But Charles II's escape, however, really became a thing of legend. After narrowly avoiding capture at Worcester, he slipped through St. Martin's Gate with a very small number of men as well. So those men obviously weren't killed or captured. But over the following weeks, he actually very narrowly avoided parliamentarian controls across England. I don't know how he did it, actually. When I was doing my research, I was reading how he managed it, and I was thinking I would definitely get caught just for breathing too heavy. But he actually famously hid in the branches of the royal oak at Boscobel to avoid being caught. So he was trying everything to not get caught, this man. And he did achieve it, because disguised as a servant and aided by still loyal royalists and supporters of him, he made his way to the south coast. And from here he escaped to France, where he actually began nearly a decade of exile. So the Battle of Worcester itself really decisively ended the English civil wars, with Cromwell himself describing it as a crowning mercy. And with Charles in exile, the royalist cause shattered, there'll be no further sort of proper or serious attempts to restore the monarchy by force during the Commonwealth either. So Cromwell's authority was also unchallenged, and within 2 years of the Battle of Worcester, so by 1653, he would assume the role of Lord Protector, not a king, but the Lord Protector, which was basically a de facto head of state for England. So, you know, now there was no longer a monarchy, the king could not be head of state, so Cromwell was like, don't you worry, I'll fill those boots. And the memory of the Battle of Worcester really did live on, despite everything. For parliamentarians, it symboled sort of God's favour to them, and also just their overwhelming victory. And for the royalists, it became a story of like loyalty, sacrifice, heroic escape. And Worcester itself also later gained the sort of pseudonym, the name, the Faithful City, after its loyalty to Charles II as royalists. And this was really, really important to them, especially in 1660, so this was after the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658, where Charles II was coronated again, and he brought with him the restoration of the monarchy. If you know Horrible Histories, there's a really good song, he was the king who brought back partying after Cromwell, and I'll actually put the link for that down in the description if I can find a link to that song. I loved it. But this battle actually even resonated worldwide, with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were two pivotal people in the founding of America. You know, they were two founding fathers and also eventually two presidents of America, coming to visit the city in 1786. So there was clearly a lot more to Worcester than it says on the tin, for lack of a better term. So overall, the Battle of Worcester was not only sort of highlighted the end of the English Civil Wars, but it really was the beginning of a new, although short-lived, era for England under a Commonwealth controlled by Oliver Cromwell. With Worcester also having been the place where the English Civil Wars started in 1642, it's very, I don't know, interesting, maybe isn't the right word, but how it all kind of came full circle would be a better terminology, that's also really where it ended. So yeah, overall, I thought this battle was really interesting, actually. This was kind of a whistle-stop tour of it, I will say, more so than an in-depth video. But I really enjoyed researching it. It's not really my area of expertise, so to say, but it was really interesting because I knew about Oliver Cromwell, but I did not know about how he really came to sort of be Lord Protector, not King, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth and everything as well. So yeah, I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure to leave a comment, give it a like, and also subscribe, because all of that really helps with my channel. And yeah, if you have anything that you would like me to sort of research and speak about, do let me know. I do take requests. Next week will be ancient history, and then the week after that will be modern history, and so on and so forth. And I will do my best as well to keep uploading every week from now. If I can't, there'll be another post as to why. But yeah, I'm back and better than ever now. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and yeah, I'll see you next time.